again, I've been studying the right for a long time, and compared to Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, Trump is by far the weakest conservative right-wing president we've had in the last 40 to 50 years. And we can talk about why and how. I've been written about that a lot, so I won't go into all of that. It seems to me that the thing that the left has to be grappling with is precisely that weakness and what that means for the left, and both the opportunities it offers, which I think are many more than people realize, and what some of the dangers are of a movement that's in decline on the right. It seems ironic to me that we would then choose a label that, again, set aside the academic niceties of the debate and the scholarship on fascism, but that we would choose a label that throughout the world signifies a kind of revanchist movement unfurled and empowered and unleashed and strengthened for a political formation that, to my mind, is the weakest that it has been in 50 years.
Hey there, welcome back to Alpha Bunga Bunga, the global politics podcast at the end of history. I'm Alex Hochuli. I'm in Sao Paulo, Brazil. This podcast is also Philip Cunliffe and George Hoare, both of whom are in the UK. Hi, guys.
Hey.
So today, very excited about this episode because we're talking to Corey Robin. I've been reading him for a very long time, following his comments on Facebook and whatnot. He's a leading intellectual light of the American left, really. For those who aren't familiar with him, he teaches at the City University of New York and is the author of The Reactionary Mind, which is his book on conservatism. I think there's been a second edition of that. If you haven't read it, I strongly urge you to check it out. His most recent book is The Enigma of Clarence Thomas. We're not talking about either of those things directly, but what are we talking about today, actually?
Yeah, a lot to get through. A lot of great stuff. Protests, race, policing, Trump, Biden, Bernie, obviously an American focus of what we'll talk about, but also some big theoretical issues in addition to all those concrete political ones as well.
Because Corey Robin has also been associated with making the case for reviving or recapturing freedom for the left, and that the left should be the main agents of defending and extending freedom within politics. And so, I mean, this is one of the reasons, the main reason, in fact, that I'm excited to have Corey on. And I've also been reading him for a long time. And as Alex and George have indicated, he's not just a political theorist, but also a major commentator on American politics and life, writing essays, articles, and so on, and is well known and engaged with seriously for being one of those commentators on American politics at the moment. So not just a political theorist, but also a political figure of the American left, debating the issues of the day. And so we want to get into some of that as well.
Yeah, I think some of the stuff also that he's done with Alex Gorovich, previous guests on the podcast, I guess just that question of how far you can resituate the mission of the left or the purpose of the left as one of freedom. Absolutely crucial. So yeah, I think to dissect some of these things with him, very much looking forward to it.
Excellent. Let's call him up. Corey, great to have you. And just to start off, as you're in New York, it'd be great if you could paint a picture for us about what the mood is like there in the midst of both lockdown and the Black Lives Matters protests.
Yeah, so let me start with the lockdown first, because I think that in part explains the mood of some of the protests. I think it really depends, and this is true obviously everywhere, but it really depends where you are in New York. I mean, the pandemic has really hit different neighborhoods very differentially. So in the wealthier white neighborhoods, like in Manhattan and parts of Brooklyn, they were hit much less badly. A lot of those neighborhoods, people, fled, went to second homes, and I think the numbers are as high as 40% of the people in parts of Manhattan left.
Wow.
And yeah, it's shockingly high. It almost, if you read some stories about the Spanish flu and pandemics in earlier centuries, it reminds me of that. Wealthy people just fled the cities, and that's really happened in New York, and then and of course poorer areas, and particularly Black and Latino communities. They've just been hit extremely hard. And then on top of that, you have, of course, this issue that people who are more working class, have had to work, been forced to work because they've been called essential workers. People who are more professional, have been able to stay home and get things done. And so you really have, a tale of two cities. And I feel like I live some of that disjuncture because I live in one of these kind of wealthier neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and I can see the way the place is emptied out. But then I also teach at the City University of New York, which is a very working class institution, predominantly immigrants and students of color, where we've had quite a number of deaths. I've not yet been able to confirm this, but I think it's probably the university throughout the world that has been hit the hardest in terms of deaths, just because of the combination of being in New York and it being a poorer institution. So that was really the setting up through May, where you had this awful sense of foreboding and the constant sirens. Every night, you could hear them all, throughout the night, it really exposed, the kind of the disparities of neoliberalism that we know about, but it kind of brought it out in very stark relief. Which is that if you were rich, you could, flee and be safe, or at least stay home. And if you weren't rich, and we're working class, you just left to die. And at the same time, without any feeling of a way out of it, throughout all of this, the refrain we've heard is, we're waiting on Cuomo, who's the governor of New York, a Democratic governor of New York, and we're waiting on Trump. So there's I can't convey the sort of the sense of powerlessness and sort of abject inaction that has been imposed, on the entire city. So that was the mood up through the end of May, early June, and then these protests exploded, and really seemingly felt like they came out of nowhere. Although, of course, that's never the case. And while there's a lot of specifics about these protests that I'm sure we'll talk some about, I think the thing that, in terms you asked about the mood, I think one of the things that they did is just sort of create this sudden sense of agency, of the possibility of momentum and of ordinary people, for lack of a better word, being able to take action. I only went to some of the more family friendly parts of these protests, but the kind of the multiracial solidarity that was on display, and then in particularly in the more kind of violent protests where there was real confrontation with the police, there was just both reading about it and watching it, just a real sense of power that I think is almost a kind of mirror image of the mood that I was describing just a second ago, during the pandemic, and so which we're still in. So overall, if I'm going to step back, and I'm sorry this is such a lengthy answer.
No, it's very interesting to hear that account. In fact, I wanted to ask what your read on the thrust of the protests was, but I'm actually curious about how the issue has been negotiated, amongst protesters, but also just amongst the wider public as a whole, which is that, you have this broad support for the lockdown and then kind of a breaking of the lockdown because of the BLM protests, and how that kind of gets negotiated, or how you've seen that be negotiated in New York.
Yeah, it's interesting. It certainly has been a subject of some discussion and contestation. I would say that what's interesting, at least in New York, I can't speak throughout the country, is it seems that there's a real sense of people all are wearing masks. One of the protests that I was at, there was actually quite a bit of social distance. It helps when the police are not raining down upon you and creating collapsing social distance. But but it's something that I think people were, and continue to be very sensitive to. But while it's something that people are, I think, arguing about a lot on social media, it doesn't seem like it has created too much of a sense of dissonance. And why that is, I don't know. And what it means, I couldn't really tell you, because I'm not in very close touch with people who are the protagonists here. But I will say, I think there's a pretty sharp consciousness of the problem. And you see a lot of very elaborate measures for, like I said, for social distancing and for hand sanitizers and all the rest of it. So it's not a kind of blithe indifference to that. There's an awareness of it. And, to be honest, I mean, the thing that I think has been more concerning is, and we're going to have to wait and see, is what's the fallout in terms of the spread of exposure and so forth, particularly from people who were thrown into jail or paddy wagons and things like that, that's where you really see the real possibility of spread. So it's a complicated issue. It's something that, as I said, it was really debated on social media, but on the ground, it seems like people are just kind of doing their best to make sense of both things at once without dishonoring either side of that debate.
Yeah, and I mean, at least here in Brazil, it's been, or in São Paulo at any rate, it's been a sort of agonized discussion where it's been mainly the right which has been out protesting, kind of in pro-Bolsonaro protests, but the left has been relatively coy about protesting so far. I think there's only been 1 or 2 weekends of that.
Presumably, though, just to on the point about the protests and the riots and so on, I mean, presumably, though, the lockdown feeds into it as well for the same reasons that it does everywhere. People being cooped up, the kind of the frustrations. Perhaps people have been furloughed, or they've lost their jobs, or they're still working, but in these kind of very strange conditions. And that general sense of restraint and suffocation and anxiety about the future, I'm sure all of that adds up to a combustible mix. And that must surely be part of the picture as well, right?
I agree. And I mean, I would also say, adding to that as well, there is, and this, what I'm about to say can always go one of two ways. But there's also a sense of, that we've been left, especially if you're, working class and poor, that you've essentially been kind of left to your own devices. There is so little leadership on the issue of the pandemic. And part of the problem always with the lockdown is that there was never any kind of real, and there continues not to be, particularly in the United States, real attempt at any kind of notion of dealing with the economic fallout of it at all. And the message, and now things are opening back up again throughout the country, even in New York, and the message is very much, you're kind of on your own. And, that can breed a kind of nihilism and a kind of individualism and escapism and all kinds of really, really terrible things. But it can also generate, in addition to all of the things, I don't know, I think it was Phil, you who were just talking, I'm trying to place, or was it George?
Yeah, it was me. Phil. About the combustible mix, yeah.
Okay. Oh, I see. Now I can see who's speaking based on the. Okay. But in addition to the things that you were describing, George, I do think there is a kind of sense of that because you're on your own, people are going to take things into their own hands. And I've just been, kind of really impressed, to be honest with you, at the spirit of defiance. Not in a kind of, I don't care about laws, I don't care about the social order in general. Quite the opposite, in fact. There's, I think, a kind of very disciplined sense of defiance and kind of collective care and solidarity that I've seen that is so striking, because there's also a kind of sense of leaderlessness and kind of lack of organizational structure, which I think has its problems long term. But nevertheless, there's kind of, I think it's just a genuine sense of solidarity, not in an anodyne, sentimental sense, but of,
Yeah. So actually, I think this leads on really nicely to something which Alex touched on earlier, which is, I guess, what's your read on the thrust of the protests? Is the focus more on policing or on race? Do you think that there's, in terms of the impact, do you think that there could be some serious reforms that will be undertaken now or in the near future?
Yeah. So, I mean, that's a complicated question with lots of different parts. So I'll just start talking.
Sorry.
No, it's totally fine. But just I'm only saying this because if I go on too long, feel free to interrupt me because I could go on for too long. The protests are clearly about both policing and race, and also I think a lot more than that as well. I think if you listen to the protesters, and I have to say I think the reporting has been, even from the mainstream media, has been quite good. A lot of very on the ground interviews with people who are out there doing this. And if you listen to what people are saying in the protests, they're talking an awful lot about policing, and they're talking an awful lot about racial inequality and racist policing. But what I've been, sort of more struck by is how much they're talking about the larger political and economic order that gives rise to the problem of racial policing. And this is not something that you would, just get from, in passing commentary on social media, but in terms of actual media and actual journalism, it's striking to me, frankly, and particularly when you listen to the younger protests, just how much they're making the connections between inadequate social solidarity, whether it's at the level of the state or the community, and hyper-policing oriented on race. There's been an awful lot of discussion about where state resources and community resources are going. And one of the things that's so impressive to me about this is that, so much of the discussion about neoliberalism, the kind of just sort of a commonsensical discussion is, well, the state is pulled back and the market steps forward. But what we're seeing now, and that was never true. I mean, that was always a kind of very superficial understanding of things.
Yeah.
But what I do think these protests, in a way, oddly enough, more than Occupy did, more than Occupy, I think these protests have really said the real issue is how the state has been reoriented under neoliberalism. And that rather than building social and economic infrastructure, everything from schools and hospitals and investment in working class communities and in jobs, instead, resources have gone to policing. Now, this isn't just a simple, 1-to-1 ratio of budgets, and obviously it's a lot more complicated. But I think the basic message that what the last 50 years have been about is about decreasing. I hate the word investment, but it's in some ways it is about investment from the state in social infrastructure and increasing reliance on punitive policing measures, which tend to fall disproportionately on Black and brown communities, but are really about policing, poor people more generally. And the fact that a lot of the discussion, about defunding the police has focused on budgets, I find very salutary, because so much of the left has been, kind of disinterested in the materiality of everyday life, the role of money and material resources. And so when you have this kind of focus on budgets and what the state has been doing, it's that Schumpeter famous line, that you can read, the history of a society through its budget. The budget or the fiscal apparatus is the thunder of world history. And my hope, and we're still very early in this, is that this conversation, which begins about race and policing, has the capacity to explode a lot bigger questions. And I think if you listen to people on the ground, that's what they're trying to do. Whether they succeed, whether this gets co-opted and all the rest, that I don't know. But
sorry to interrupt, but I actually wanted to push you a little bit on what you see as the strengths and limitations of precisely of this idea of either defund the police or abolish the police, because I think, it's hard to judge from the outside, and following on social media, of course, kind of gives you a relatively warped picture of what's actually going on. So how do you see this? I'm relatively skeptical of the idea of abolish the police, whereas defund the police, I can see a lot more mileage in that. So how do you see that sort of playing out?
And just to add a rider to that, Corey, this is Philip. Just to add a rider to that, what seems to me so striking about, it's this astonishingly kind of radical slogan that has gained such traction, abolish the police. But at the same time, as many critics have already pointed out, in the contemporary context, without the infrastructure of popular or working class radical politics, inevitably abolish would mean privatize effectively. And it would just kind of collapse into the neoliberal status quo. You would end up with effectively a greater recourse to private security forces of various kinds, and that you would see, in fact, a further kind of erosion of precisely that public provision, paradoxically, that you just mentioned. So I was curious about the kind of the convoluted paradoxes of this moment with, like I say, radical slogans that could potentially backfire in an unexpected and terrible way. And obviously, most American voters don't support abolishing the police. Right. So I was wondering if you could untangle some of that for us in the American context.
Yeah, so I want to be careful here because I don't feel like I'm, an activist in this movement, and so I can't. I don't want to, put words in people's mouths and all that kind of stuff. But my sense is that, if, for instance, Black Lives Matter has a platform, and when you look at it, it's actually quite a kind of radical vision of social democracy. It doesn't get that much attention in the media, but from the people I've spoken to, I think it really plays quite a role in the sort of the vision of what this movement is about. And from what I can see, it's really about transferring resources and reimagining the role of the state. Now, I know there is a debate among certain activists about abolish the police, defund the police, and how that plays out. Again, I think it's too soon to tell. Frankly, just parenthetically, my bigger concern is not that people actually go ahead and do, abolish the police and we get the kind of privatized dystopia you're describing. My bigger fear is that, there'll just be kind of pretty anodyne measures that'll come out of this. So, for instance, I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. About a week ago, the Minneapolis City Council got an awful lot of attention because they voted to disband the police and replace it with a kind of more community-oriented safety program. I just went to check. So what's really going on with this proposal, which was voted up a week ago? And instead, what's happening is consultants are now being brought in. There's a group called Benchmark Analytics, and they're doing all of this long-term tracking of individual police behavior. It's a very individualist and not a structural solution at all. And it involves the consultant and the NGO class, which is the worst thing, or not the worst thing, but one of the worst things that can happen. So I think, probably if we're being realistic, the bigger problem is there's a lot of fervor and sloganeering and intense kind of emotion and political action, and then when the dust settles, it's these these horrible high priced consultants who are brought in do that kind of bullshit. And which is the other side, of course, of neoliberalism. So I'm honestly more concerned about that. What does give me hope is, again, like in New York City right now, there's movement among schools activists, in the public schools, which are, incredibly unequal. And the funding has been so low. Aggressively, using this moment to say, these are resources that we, should be now putting in to schools. There's a huge movement in CUNY, where I teach, City University, about not cutting back, but on adjunct budgets, but instead expanding. And again, using the moment to say, now is the time to invest in communities. So I think, this is again where social media debates can be so misleading and aggravating. And so I think that's both the more promising side of this, and I think the more dangerous side is really just this all getting, this moment getting wasted in a lot of idiotic consultants and that kind of stuff.
Right.
Yeah, I can see that.
Right. Yeah, and thanks, Corey. So we had a few questions for you on party politics, and I guess also your take on the upcoming presidential election. Probably to start with, I think a lot of people frame Trump as essentially as a fascist, either with or without qualification. But could you restate for us and our listeners your argument about Trump not being a fascist?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that the easiest, simplest way is just to start right now in the present moment. From the time that Trump got elected, there's been this foreboding and this statement, this fear that all that he is waiting for is an emergency, a kind of a national security crisis, some kind of public emergency, and then he'll go full on fascist. I mean, that's been the more sober version of the argument. Some people have said he's been doing it from the get-go. But this is what we've heard, and people have said, then you're going to see full-on suspension of civil liberties, suppression of the media, criminalization of all the traditional things that fascists do when they assume control of the state. Yep. And the fact is, we are now in the middle of three, in fact, extraordinary crises. We have a public health crisis in the United States where over 100,000 people have died. Just an extraordinary public health crisis, an extraordinary economic crisis with levels of unemployment that oftentimes in the past were associated with not just the rise of fascist parties, but the election of fascist parties. And now this sort of cascading role of public protests and attacks on the fundamentals of the police state, and with a kind of urban disorder and chaos that in the past would really see the presidents of all stripes sending in federal troops. Mm-hmm. And what has been most amazing about Trump, particularly on the first two, which is the public health and the economic crisis, and I'll get to the other one in a minute, is how much he has withdrawn from the exercise of state power, not just disclaiming any sense of responsibility, but refusing all the opportunities that one would think somebody who is of a fascist political stripe would be engaged in. The media is more outspoken than ever. In fact, just a year or two ago, there was a study in The Intercept, the newspaper, the website, comparing Trump's control over the media to George W. Bush, and it was no comparison. I mean, George W. Bush completely intimidated the media and was much more able to suppress oppositional voices. There's been nothing with the media. Far from suspending Congress and suspending the legislature, if anything, it's been Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. Nancy Pelosi is the Democratic Speaker of the House. Mitch McConnell is the Republican Senate Majority Leader. If anything, they're the ones who are choosing not to have Congress in session. Elections have been happening, and not only that, we're seeing left-wing politicians elected. There was a round of state elections quite recently in New Mexico and in Pennsylvania and in Washington D.C. You saw elections of left progressive figures, and on the policing crisis. I mean, this got a fair amount of attention because Trump did make a lot of the rhetorical gestures about sending in the troops and saying that if governors and mayors didn't get their cities in order, he would. And he said this. But outside of D.C., Washington, D.C., which is a federal jurisdiction, he hasn't, done much of anything except, bluster on Twitter every day, law and order, law and order, law and order. The violence that we have seen, the really scary stuff that gets all the headlines and the attention, are in cities where you have either Democratic mayors and or Democratic governors of states who are in control of those police. It's just.
You wait for a Reichstag fire, and three come along at once, and he doesn't hop on a single one.
You brought up the Reichstag fire. I mean, that's the phrase we've heard: the Reichstag moment, the Reichstag moment, the Reichstag moment. And now, I should say I've never believed this because Trump has had other moments where he could have played this card and he didn't. But I think this one it's pretty clear. Lyndon Johnson, sent in federal troops, and it was extraordinarily violent, the counterinsurgency in the cities in 1967. Now, if you want to say Lyndon Johnson's administration was fascist, I mean, leftists did at the time, but most people today wouldn't say something like that. So, the stuff that we do see is a very traditional feature of the state and doesn't really require anything like the fascist label to understand. And what's more interesting, given the predictions, is what we haven't seen from Trump.
So I guess just to take a step back, what do you think is the political function or consequences of describing Trump as a fascist, or what have they been? I guess why is it politically an important position to take that Trump isn't in fact a fascist?
I mean, I think there's a couple of reasons why it's important. The first is that empirically, I just think it's wrong. And it's interesting in this hyper politicized moment. Everybody's always interested in the political valence of an argument, and the actual empirical data doesn't really matter very much. But I think it's important, just to say that empirically it's wrong. Politically, I think there's a couple of reasons. And first, let me disavow one of the reasons that I think people think it's politically important. I don't think this is true. So let me say why it's politically not important. Some people fear that if you use the fascist label, it's just being used to authorize support for Joe Biden in a kind of centrist Democratic thing. And that's true sometimes that sure. is what it does. But I think there are many people who use the fascist label who aren't interested in that kind of politics at all. Anarchists, DSA, Democratic Socialists, a whole bunch of leftists are firmly believe in the fascist label, but they're not using it to authorize centrism. So I don't think that's the problem. So what I do think is the problem is threefold, actually, the political problem with the label. I mean, the first thing is that it tends to separate Trump from more mainstream Republican and conservative movements and policies. I've been writing about the right for almost 20 years now. And long before Trump, I came to this argument that the right was essentially a reactionary formation, that it's revanchist and it's populist. It's opposed oftentimes to established institutions. And I don't want to, I've talked about that a lot, so I don't need to here. But the reason I bring it up is that there is an effort to separate Trump from that history. And I think that's very dangerous and wrongheaded in many, many ways. So that's the first. The second is that people want to use, the reason why people turn to the fascist label. I mean, we can get into a lot of academic arguments about it, but I think we'd just be honest and frank about why people turn to it. And that is that it signifies a kind of, the beating heart of white supremacy and the beating heart of the nation, and that it somehow speaks for some popular dispensation that is out there. And I think that's very misleading, because what Trump is overwhelmingly about is a minoritarian dispensation. He is a president who depends upon institutions that are profoundly anti-democratic and that were meant to protect numerical minorities, not racial or ethnic minorities. And by that, I mean the Senate, the Electoral College, and the Supreme Court. These are the pillars of his support. He is not sustained by a populist movement. And so I think that's something that's very important. And then I think we come to the last part of this. Once you realize that Trump is sustained by things like the Senate, the Supreme Court, and the Electoral College, what you see is that ultimately what he's really sustained by is the United States Constitution. that these are institutions that are part of a haloed, sacrosanct document in this country. And for many people who defend Trump as fascist, the answer to that is defend the Constitution. And that is a profoundly wrong-headed approach, because long after Trump is gone, and I said this in 2017, I said this, I think, 3 or 4 months into his regime, and it hardly took, it wasn't any kind of prescience on my part. It's just, if you know anything about American history, long after he is gone, what will be the caretaker and custodian of his legacy will be the United States courts and the Supreme Court. That's will be the thing that will protect him. And if you are serious about, if you think, I mean, I think most people now, aside from some very, very centrist people, but most people now realize that Trump represents something larger and bigger than just himself. If you are serious about gutting that and getting rid of that, you have to take on the American Constitution. You have to take on the Supreme Court. You have to take on all these things that many of these defenders of this thesis thought were the things that were protecting us, and in fact attacked Trump because he was eroding them. And we're going to have to do our own massive form of norm erosion. And so I think in all these different ways, the Trump is fascism thesis, besides being empirically wrong. And, let me just say, sorry, if you don't mind, just one more thing about this, because it irritates me so much. Is that, you know, again, I've been studying the right for a long time, and compared to Nixon, Reagan, and Bush, Trump is by far the weakest conservative right-wing president we've had in the last 40 to 50 years. And we can talk about why and how. I've been written about that a lot, so I won't go into all of that. It seems to me that the thing that the left has to be grappling with is precisely that weakness and what that means for the left, and both the opportunities it offers, which I think are many more than people realize, and you know what some of the dangers are of a movement that's in decline on the right. It seems ironic to me that we would then choose a label that, again, set aside the academic niceties of the debate and the scholarship on fascism, but that we would choose a label that throughout the world signifies the kind of revanchist movement unfurled and empowered and unleashed and strengthened for a political formation that, to my mind, is the weakest that it has been in 50 years. And that seems like just at the basic level of kind of discourse, just seems like a very, very wrong-headed move to me.
Absolutely.
I think you're spot on, Corey. And I suppose to draw out what you're saying, the notion that Trump is weak, and I think this it's been a consistent theme of your writing to some degree, reaching back to the reactionary mind, your point that the right is it organizes itself around opposition to the left. And even to that extent, it's still ultimately incoherent in the way in which that it mobilizes itself in opposition to the left. So doesn't this point about the profound weakness of the Trump administration, doesn't it ultimately redound to re-emphasize the weakness of the left at the moment, and precisely the fact that, in their own minds, he's transmogrified into this kind of overwhelming fascist authoritarian figure bearing down on them, when in fact he's much more of a pygmy.
Yeah. I mean, this has been, it's strange, because when I have argued that Trump is weak thesis, many people keep saying it's an optimistic claim and it's hopeful. And I think to myself, what are you missing in my argument? Because part of why the right is so weak is because it won its battle against the left. If you, and I'll be a little bit more local with the American context, which I have been throughout here. But the modern American right came about in response, first and foremost, to the workers' movement, the labor movement of the 1920s and the 1930s. That was its first and primal antagonist, and it's safe to say that it won that battle. And then it's secondarily the Black freedom struggle of the 1960s. And for the most part, it won that battle as well. The United States today is more segregated, racially segregated, than it was in the 1980s. the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap, all of these things. So the right won big time. And the left has not come to terms with that defeat. You see people say, no, the victory of Obama, and, that empowered the right. And, it's certainly the case that there are parts of the American right, many parts that were, very set on edge by the victory of Obama. And yet, compared to the kind of empowerment the right got when it was facing the sort of dispossession, the limited dispossession that both the Black freedom struggle and the workers' movement in the United States were able to achieve through the New Deal and the Civil Rights Movement, the right was fully able to mobilize against that because those were real victories by the left, and the right came back, with such intense ferocity. And not just at emotional level. I mean, because that also mistakes what the right is about. It completely reinvented itself intellectually, politically, institutionally, organizationally. And it won a comprehensive victory, this kind of counter-revolution. And so the left has really, really been defeated. And then once you see that, I think, as you say, the kind of the theatrics of Trump become much, much more intelligible. And it makes sense that he is tweeting all day because that is what the right, in many ways has become. And not because, of anything, heroic on the left, far from it. It's because the left has been so defeated.
So I guess linking all of this to the prospect of a Biden victory, which at the moment the polls seem to be indicating, how do you think the left in its sort of weakness or defeats might respond to this victory? Yeah. Also, given I guess how deeply they seem to have waded into these arguments about Trump destroying the institutions of the republic.
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and I'm always leery of making predictions because I'm so wrong half the time, more than half the time. But I suspect you're going to see a kind of very mixed response. And by that, I mean, I do think there are going to be many people who are going to want a kind of return to the institutions, a kind of a restoration. And that certainly fits with Biden's profile. And there are already, you're seeing in parts of the Democratic Party, for instance, a kind of concern about the debt and the deficit. So, you could hear the rumblings of austerity politics, which I think is a smaller part of the Democratic Party than it used to be, but nevertheless, in alliance with the Republicans, can do a shitload of damage. So I think that will be definitely one part, a kind of respect for the institutions and all the rest of it. I do think one of the things that's been interesting is that there's been a shift, not just among sort of leftists, but I think even among some liberals, to start questioning some of these issues about, for instance, the Senate and the filibuster and the Supreme Court. Right. And I do think I think so. The long or the short answer to your question is there's going to be, I think, a real battle. You saw the rumblings of this, frankly, in the Obama administration, but I think it's going to be even more pitched because I do think there is a larger portion of the left and even among liberals that are now a little bit clearer about the right and its willingness, even though it's weak, to play what's called procedural hardball. I hate these sports metaphors, but this is the discourse.
We're wedded to them.
And so, I think there'll be less patience for the idea of sort of bipartisan cooperation, which you heard so much of with Obama. Which side will win is an open question. I mean, I still think I bet on the kind of Biden centrist side of things because I think they have a tremendous amount of power in the left. I mean, the left just doesn't have it and we saw that in this primary. The left is still weak.
Yeah, actually, just to maybe just quickly push you on this before moving on to some, I guess, bigger theoretical questions. How would you account for Bernie's defeat? This is something which we've touched on in previous episodes, so it'd be good to get your take on it.
Yeah, I mean, it's something that I don't have a very good answer to, except to basically restate the premise of the question, which is, Bernie was just defeated because, the left is fairly weak. I mean, you still have an awful lot of Democratic voters who are fairly centrist, even conservative. Many of them older, white, and black. And the generational divide is intense within the Democratic Party. And it's just that this battle has not been won. And I can get a little primitive about these things in my explanations, which is, that we can get all sort of, and there's been a lot of autopsies of the Sanders campaign. Did it go too culturally left and all the rest of it? Or was it not left enough? I mean, and the truth of the matter is we just don't have, a lot of these ideas are still scary to a lot of people. And we don't have the votes. I think that's changing. But the I don't know what the word is, the kind of distortion and defeat of the left is very comprehensive, and it's just going to take some time to kind of reorient people. And I mean, I think we're beginning to see it even in this pandemic. The fact that the kind of numbers that people have been willing to spend and throw around in terms of these economic packages. I mean, again, this gets very simplistic, but during the stimulus debate under Obama, they could never get to that number 1 trillion because it was just too big. Well, they've now spent trillions of dollars on this pandemic thing. So we've crossed the Rubicon. So I do feel like things are opening up, and it's just it's going to take a lot of time.
The old models were thrown away surprisingly quickly, yes. Which leaves space hopefully for some new ones. Alex.
Yes. Yeah, so, well, now we should transition, I guess, to we've been going for a little while, but now's the real meaty stuff, which is the arguments around freedom, which you've made, Corey, specifically the left argument for freedom and arguments around the idea that even something like Medicare for All is or should be framed in terms of freedom. So in a recent article that you wrote with Alex Gurevich, previous guest on this podcast, that the economy should be cast not as a realm of freedom of individual choice and liberty, but really as a realm of unfreedom, and specifically that the forms of unfreedom that you get in the market, in the economy, are subordination and limitation. So I wondered if, first of all, is to get us started on this sort of section, if you could explain us out what those terms mean and how the economy is a realm of unfreedom.
Yeah. So the first thing that I always begin with, this comes both from my own political experience and research long before my first book was on the politics of fear, and where I always begin when I think about unfreedom is the workplace. This has changed somewhat over the years, but throughout the years, I've always been astonished at how little attention subordination in the workplace, the kind of domination, the legally prescribed and legally authorized domination in the workplace, how systemic it actually is. In recent years, I think this has now begun to resonate with more people. But when I first began talking about this in the 1990s, and it was this terra incognita. I mean, that people just did not think about the workplace as an institution of domination and rule at all. I assume, for your listeners, that I don't have to rehearse those arguments, but it really is quite extensive. And so that's where we begin our piece as well, with just the intensiveness of subordination and domination in the workplace, where just living with a kind of rule and a kind of an authority that you wouldn't see outside of a prison or the military, but is the common feature of everyday life for so many people, the subordination in the workplace. But then you step outside of the workplace, and sorry, one more thing, because you had asked me about sort of market discipline, and I think the market is a word that is both very helpful, but also sometimes a little bit obscuring, because the workplace, even though it's a part of the marketplace, is nevertheless, it's not like the paradigmatic, customer and a grocer.
There's some people trading things.
Yeah, exactly. It really is, kind of like an old world, old regime form of submission to authority. And so I just always want to bring us back to that, because it's so easily glossed over and forgotten. But the second part of it, which I think gets us into the marketplace a little bit more, is about the intensive spread of market discipline to so many spheres of social life and social goods. And this argument is probably a little bit more familiar to listeners, but it's striking between the combination of indebtedness and then the use of market mechanisms to deal with everything from schools to healthcare to retirement, all these ways in which we are pushed into being market actors. It's interesting, just parenthetically, during this stimulus package, just the sheer issuance of a check. And I'm not somebody who thinks guaranteed UBI or anything like that is the panacea, but just the sheer issuance of a check without a lot of kind of market rigmarole is just a sort of breathtaking experience that I don't think most people, aside from the very rich who get dividends, are used to. So the spread of that market discipline, I think, has been intense. And then one more thing I'll say about this, and I'll stop, is that the thing that Alex and I wrote about once we laid out these different features is if you go back to Hayek, who I think is safely taken as one of the key theoreticians of the neoliberal turn, what's most striking is that there's no obfuscation of this in the writing. It's all there plain as day. That the real agenda of neoliberalism is the real understanding of freedom in neoliberalism is not freedom to choose, which is the famous Milton Friedman title, freedom to choose. It's being forced to choose. That it is only under conditions of severe constraint, when one is really thrown up against the wall of material circumstance and facing economic exigency of some sort. It's only in those moments that one is forced to choose and really reveals one's ultimate moral preferences and one's ultimate moral self. And so it's similar to the kind of battlefield ethics that you saw in a lot of fascist, sort of war mythology. That in the foxhole you have to reveal who you are under these conditions of life and death. And for Hayek. It's really in these conditions of extremis, facing material constraint, whether the constraint of the marketplace or constraint of the workplace, that one reveals oneself as to who one is. And that's freedom. What we believe is that we need a notion of freedom that not only counteracts that, but also both liberates you from the economy, but also liberates you within the economy. And
But so neoliberalism, in a sense, is manufacturing. It requires the recreation of scarcity in order to motivate itself or to give the kind of moral weight and gravitas to its mission. Is that right? So it has to kind of create scarcity through the extension of the market to all of these domains from which it had previously been beaten back or restricted or curbed, in order to give this kind of existential dimension to freedom, which it had hitherto lacked. Would that be right?
Yeah, absolutely. That's very well put. And I think I think people on the left have begun to pay more attention to these arguments on the right and so forth. But I do think there's still this sort of facile notion on many people in the left that somehow or another what the right is about is, this kind of very individualistic freedom, this this vulgar libertarian notion of freedom, but they miss this element that you said, of existential choice and of manufactured scarcity, that the right really believes only under those conditions, will sort of individual freedom be expressed.
So I wanted to ask, maybe we could return a little bit, because I think people are familiar with the notion. I mean, as you've discussed, effectively, I guess to put it in more basic terms, that people are aware of this idea of being alone in the market, of being forced to choose, and that represents a pretty miserly idea of humanity, of freedom. But the notion of subordination in the workplace, I mean, you said that people probably are familiar with the examples, but actually might be worth, because you do mention a couple in the articles and in other things you've written, some of the ways in which domination inheres within a large corporation, in the workplace. So you can maybe spell out some examples of how that works.
Sure. And let me say, it's really the workplace, because it's not simply large corporations. I mean, some of these small shops are these, extraordinarily
arguably worse.
Tyrannies. Yeah. In fact, it's definitely worse. But one of the early pieces I wrote was, I think was called Liberty and Lavatory, which was about the history of the bathroom break in the United States. And again, I don't know what it's like in other countries, so this could be a very U.S. specific story on this one. But it was not until, believe it or not, 1998 when Bill Clinton issued an executive order. It's not even a law; it's an executive order, so it could be rescinded. That workers were guaranteed the right, if they had to go to the bathroom to urinate, that they would be allowed to go. And what was happening, and I haven't looked at this more recently, so I don't know what the more recent literature is on this, but that what was happening is you would just have many workers, predominantly Latino and Black, predominantly women, who were essentially forced to wear adult diapers because they were not free to go to the bathroom when they had to go. And, I always think of this example because, again, I think both the right and the left sometimes converge on these, notions that, the right defends this sort of very simplistic Hobbesian notion of freedom as, freedom as physical motion of the body.
Yeah.
And the left, sort of takes that for granted. But the truth of the matter is that most basic physical mobility of the body and bodily functions are massively constrained in the workplace. So that's a very visible and sort of dramatic case, but it extends to all kinds of things. Basic rights of privacy in the workplace are not allowed. You could be searched in any way. Basic freedoms of speech are not allowed, not just in the workplace, but outside the workplace. And this has become, actually now people are beginning to pay more attention to this because we've had a lot of these Twitter cases where people say things on social media and then they get fired for it summarily. There's, now there's a lot of cases where, the left is doing the same thing as the right and so on. But if we could just step back from some of those, kinds of arguments on Twitter, this is just a systemic problem in the United States, where what people say on social media, what they do in the privacy of their own homes, there are all kinds of court cases where, people who engage in group sex, are, in their own home are fired at work. In some ways, the recent Supreme Court case that just came out the other day about protecting LGBTQ workers, part of its significance is that, people were being fired for, engaging in gay sex off the job. And, that's not just an issue for LGBTQ people. That really is an issue for workers. So the authoritarian structure of the workplace, both what you can be punished and regulated for at work, and then what you can be punished and regulated at work for things that you do off the job, is intense. And it is, again, this sort of vast arena that just goes unnoticed. And so one of the things that I think, you asked about Medicare for all at the beginning.
Yeah.
One of the things that I would like to reframe, both Alex and I would like to reframe that as is a question of freedom, because when you are dependent for your job on something like healthcare, and you have, let's say, a family, but even if you don't, quitting a job becomes it's not just a loss of earning, it's a loss of, basic health security. And so what Medicare for all, what universal health care is, I think, really about, is not about, protecting people's health only. It's about securing emancipation for, all people.
Yeah.
And, you can multiply that, from Medicare for all to things like pensions, to things like education. There's so many things that we have that are dependent upon both where we work and the conditions of our work, and that really constrains ultimately people's freedom. If you just go back to the old kind of Millian notion of freedom as a kind of experiments in living, and there's lots of different kinds of freedom, but just that basic notion of being willing and able to kind of experiment with different designs of patterns of one's life, it is radically constrained by
even that basic market. Yeah, sorry, even that basic market freedom, I mean, the right wing and libertarian notion that you could just go and work somewhere else is seriously impeded by the fact that your healthcare is tied to your work.
Yeah. I mean, and just on that, I've been reading a lot of Smith and Keynes lately for a piece I'm working on. Even that notion that you're free to go somewhere else to work. Forget even the healthcare part of this. Smith realized early. He says this, and it's not just because of poor laws. He says, because people are, labor is just not mobile like that in the same way that goods are. People have attachments. They are tied to a community. They're tied to a whole thing. So the idea that just pick up and go, it's just so fantastical. That when he doesn't even need to get into this issue of healthcare and all the rest of it. But I think it's important to bring that up because it also just shows you the systemic constraints that are put on somebody just being able to up and quit.
So I wanted to push you a bit further, Corey, on this question of the project for the left. So you've mentioned, or we've been talking about how Medicare for All might emancipate people from the constraints associated with the limitations on health security. And that's very clear how that works in the US. But I suppose at a more general level, is it that are you making the case then for, say, workplace regulations? Is it about, and I suppose the question is it about freeing workers from work or freeing them in work?
I think it's both. And, this is something that I think people go back and forth on the left. And I hate to be that person who says it's not, either or, it's both and. But in this case, it really is both. I mean, Alex and I have I think are a little bit in disagreement about this, but not in a fundamental way. But I think the easiest answer to that is that part of the Freedom Project is to have less work and to get rid of overwork and needless work to the extent that it can be gotten rid of. So I think part of it is to be emancipated from work. And I think also a big part of it is to be emancipated at work or in work. And I think both of those things are true. We need more leisure. We need more time and freedom in that sense. But that's not, I think it's wrong. It's both not just impractical. I think it's just wrong-headed to say that that's the only thing, because I also think people want to be free at work as well, and to have more voice on the job, both to speak up on matters unrelated to the job, but also matters that are related to the job. And I think, that's part of a kind of a vision of emancipation and human flourishing that requires both of those elements.
But that redounds immediately to the next kind of issue, which goes back to what we've been talking about. Given the weakness of organized labor today, where does the left go about achieving those kind of twofold aims you just mentioned?
Yeah, if I knew the answer to that question, I'd have a lot more influence. It's a very, very tough question, but I don't see a way around it. Honestly, it has to be confronted, and I think we're beginning to see some kind of solidaristic action. I mean, I think this. I mean, before we get to the decline of labor. I mean, in some ways, your question is even harder because it's not just the fact that organized labor is, practically dead as an institution. It's all the political art of solidarity and the political knowledge that the labor movement created for the world. And, something that Alex and I talk about at the end, that, one of the things you actually learn at work, forget even organized labor, but one of the things you learn at work is how to cooperate with people who are not people you would have chosen to cooperate with.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
That is a fundamental political question, which makes the workplace, I think, the most important classroom there is for politics. And that's what the labor movement then was able to take and externalize onto the polity at large, creating mass political parties, and all the combination of compromise and confrontation and articulating a common platform out of difference. It pains me when I hear people just reduce organized labor to these simplistic, slogans, whether you're pro or against the labor movement about, class and so forth, because that's not what the labor movement was about. It was about creating political knowledge of the arts of cooperation and the arts of confrontation that had not existed before. And that there was a reason why the right went after that, because it understood very clearly what a threat it was. And so many people in the civil rights movement came out of the labor movement, not only the labor movement, but came out of that experience and began applying that to other domains of social life. And that's what we have lost. And that is what we have to recreate. And, what's so frustrating about our moment, and this comes back to something we talked about earlier, is, the right is so weak. And part of what sustains that weakness is the weakness of the left, and the disorganization and the incoherence on the left, and the inability to figure out the combination of freedom and discipline and organization and confrontation and compromise, all these different things that, the labor movement didn't figure it out by any stretch, but had begun to think it through. And we've lost that. And so, the answer to your question, how do we get through? How do we get there? Is we just start. And I know that sounds very voluntaristic and kind of, throwing up your hands in hope and faith. But I don't know any other way except, to enter that classroom where there's repeated failure. And through that failure, you begin, you hopefully every time, if there's the right leadership on the ground, I don't think any of this is inevitable. But if there's the kind of right leadership on the ground that can kind of begin to learn the lessons and start doing them better the next time.
Absolutely. That's extremely well put. And I think highlighting that role of, political education that you receive through struggle is really important and too often forgotten. Just to kind of wrap this up, and to maybe put a more positive, but potentially positive spin on it, we have an unfortunate reputation of having kind of doomly endings. So, trying our best to be positive here. I think possibly two potentially positive things to emerge from the pandemic. I mean, if we can try to extract some positivity from it, is one, the focus on the value of the so-called essential worker, something which you referred to already earlier, and certain networks of spontaneous solidarity that have emerged in trying to, kind of mutual aid to help people within a neighborhood, as well as, workers retooling their, factories to produce medical equipment and things like that. So, I mean, do you see a reason to be hopeful there? And a follow-on question, which I'm going to tack on immediately, if you'll excuse me, is how would you see this playing out in a situation of maybe, 15 or even 20% unemployment in the US?
Yeah, so I think I definitely do think, I'm somebody who tends to be skeptical of theories of spontaneous solidarity. It goes against my organizational and leadership sort of instincts and institutional instincts. However, I have been, really, both, thrilled and surprised by the kinds of acts of solidarity that you've been talking about, both, in the workplace, and then also in terms of, fighting for kind of basic health and safety protections that are not there. And there's and I connect this to some of these rallies and protests we've been seeing. I mean, anybody who's been on the left for the last 20 years has just had this sense of dreariness. Yet another protest march you have to go to, which is so ritualized and formalized. And you hold up your signs and you say, no this, no justice, no peace, and blah, blah, blah. And one of the things that has been so impressive about, especially the first week of the protests, is just how defiantly confrontational, again, not in a nihilistic or just, defiance for the sake of defiance, which I don't believe in, but in the sense that we're not playing by your rules anymore. And we are not waiting for somebody else to do this. And I do think there's a kind of more of a spirit of that that's out there. Now, that is not by any means sufficient. And, I think anybody who has any kind of romantic notions that somehow or another that gets us anywhere, that's just not the case. But I do think there is a kind of cooperative spirit that's also confrontational that, my hope is really breaks with, not just neoliberalism and not just the Republican Party and not just the Democratic Party, but just the sclerotic nature of political protest and the ritualized nature of it, where you don't think you're ever really going to do anything. You're just doing it out of duty. Mm-hmm. And I could be wrong, but my sense is part of these things that people are now seeing and unemployment figures that only adds to this isn't performative anymore. This is this is something that's intended to do something. Now, what that intention is and what we do and comes out of it, that's a very open question. But I do think there's a greater intensity and seriousness that I'm seeing, which is, comes from the sense, which is as old as the workers' movement itself. It's just, like, nobody's going to do this for you. You have to do it yourself. And that does give me a certain degree of hope to the extent that I allow myself to have it.
Mm. Well, I mean, that's fascinating and potentially quite encouraging to hear. And as a whole, thank you, Corey, for that. That's been hugely insightful. So thank you for joining us for this.
Oh, thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. I apologize for going on so long.
No, absolutely not. You could go on for much longer as far as I'm concerned. Hey, you want to hear Corey go on for a lot longer? The bonus footage will be out in a week or two for patrons at patreon.com/bungacast. Also coming up on our Patreon is 3 articles in which the 3 hosts, myself, Alex, George and Phil, discuss the global BLM protests. Plus, we've got bonus footage from our upcoming episode on Saudi foreign proselytization with Krithika Baragur and a reading club on the Ehrenreich's reevaluation of the PMC. All that to look forward to. Catch you later. Bye-bye.